Hello, good afternoon and welcome. I'm hoping that you are able to see and hear me. It's actually raining crazy here in Oviedo and Orlando area. My name is Güneş Murat Tezcur. I'm a professor and the chair of Kurdish politics at the School of Politics, Security and International Affairs. I just want to say a few words about the idea behind this teaching before I basically let Brandon start the event. It emerged from conversations among a small group of faculty, including my colleagues, Tom Gordon at History, Kerry Weston at School of Visual Arts and Design, both of them are presenters here today, and Julia Liston-Gardner at Theater. I'm grateful for their support and our presenters' involvement. We think that a core mission of our public university is to address and generate greater understanding of racial violence, discrimination, and inequality facing our society. The legacy of slavery, lynchings, and segregation continues to haunt the air we breathe, and some of us could not breathe, obviously. As we have seen viscerally earlier this year in South Georgia in February, Louisville in March, and Minneapolis in May, this legacy often exhibits itself in naked and sheer brutality. Systematic racism is a more insidious force, but not less ominous. It affects how we remember history locally, nationally, and globally, how we value and grieve certain lives more than others, how some of us, but not others, have access to higher quality healthcare, housing, and education, and how some of us, but not others, enjoy safe, long, free, and wealthy life in this country. And unless one is harmed by the system, it is disturbingly easy to be complicit in it. As you will hear soon, our speakers will reflect on these pervasive effects of systematic racism. We live through an unprecedented national and global moment that is fraught with both despair and hope. As a political scientist who studied political violence and democracy in different countries, I think collective political action, whether voting or protesting, makes a difference, especially during these times. It is our hope that our event will animate our audience, especially our UCF students, to take an active stance against the persistent legacies of racism. The decision we make now will matter for our future, obviously. I would like to thank the College of Arts and Humanities, College of Sciences, and Faculty Excellence for their available support. And my special thanks go to Tiffany Rivera, who's at the History Department. Tiffany has been a mover and shaker that made this event possible. Brandon Nightingale is our moderator. Brandon is a recent graduate of UCF. He has 2 degrees from our university, a BA and an MA in History, the most recent one in 2019. He's currently a librarian at the Bettina Cookman University in Daytona Beach. Brandon, now you're in charge.
Thank you, Ganesh, and hello to everyone joining us via Zoom and YouTube. My name is Brandon Nightingale. I'm a 2-time history graduate from UCF, and I'm the current archival coordinator at Bethune-Cookman University. Historically Black Bethune-Cookman University was established in Daytona Beach, Florida in 1904 by humanitarian and civil rights activist Mary McLeod Bethune. I'm excited to be your moderator for today's virtual teach-in titled Black Lives, Racism and Struggle for Justice in the American Democracy. Today's teach-in will be led by UCL faculty from the College of Arts and Humanities and College of Sciences. Some of you may be wondering, what exactly is a teach-in? Teach-ins are educational forums that explore issues through many lenses while engaging participants and serving as a call to action. The term is a play off the term sit-in, which have been a popular protesting format. Teach-ins date back to 1965 during the Civil Rights Movement, where 50 teachers from the University of Michigan held an all-night event of debates, lectures, movies, and musical elements to inform and engage the campus community about the Vietnam War. Today's teach-in will cover aspects of systematic racism against Black people in America, as well as include international perspectives on these issues. A little bit about the format. Today's teach-in will be divided into 2 mini sessions. Each speaker will have 10 minutes for their presentation, and I'm asking that the speakers do not exceed the allocated time to make sure that all speakers are given enough time to present. We will solicit questions from our audience via the Q&A function at the end of each mini session. We have a great group of speakers for our audience today, and I want to introduce you to them before they begin. First, we have Dr. Fawn Gordon, Associate Professor from the Department of History. Then we will hear from Bumi K. Thakor, Assistant Professor from the Department of Sociology. After that, we will hear from Dr. Kerry Watson, Assistant Professor from the School of Visual Arts and Design. And wrapping up our first session will be Dr. Kanisha Wright, Assistant Professor from the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. Once again, thank you to our presenters. And now I'm going to hand it over to one of my professors from both undergrad and graduate school at UCF, Dr. Fawn Gordon, who will be discussing Dispossession, Racial Disadvantage, and Public Policy. The floor is yours, Dr. Gordon.
Good afternoon. I am Fawn Gordon, and to repeat what Brandon said, the title of my presentation, my brief presentation this afternoon, is Dispossession, Racial Disadvantage, and Public Policy. We are all familiar with the notion of racial reparations, compensation for the injuries of slavery and segregation. But in addition to reparations, I suggest there is a second category that we should consider, dispossession. The dispossession of Black Americans has deprived them, at the very least, of citizenship, civility, the value of their labor, a decent reputation, good health, and state protection. So I suggest that dispossession is a synonym for structural or systemic racism. At the end of the Civil War, Congress passed the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished the institution of slavery except as punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment defined birthright citizenship, and the 15th Amendment provided universal male suffrage, which enabled Black men to vote. Along with the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution and the Civil Rights Act of 1866, the Reconstruction Amendments elevated African Americans to citizenship and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws and due process. During radical Reconstruction from 1867 to 1877 and after redemption, the emergence of the solid democratic New South witnessed an estimated 2,000 Black men who served at the 2,000 Black men who served at the local, state, and federal levels, including 2 US senators, 20 congressmen, and 1 governor from 1870 to 1901. The white supremacy campaign to invalidate the gains of Reconstruction and deprive African Americans of their constitutional rights included sharecropping and segregation, forced labor, lynchings and race massacres, medical malpractice, as well as devastating mass racial representations of contempt and condemnation. At the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis while in police custody and during the coronavirus pandemic, media coverage of mass protests against law enforcement brutality noted that many of those involved had traveled, quote, from the suburbs to the cities, close quote. That observation is emblematic of the spatial configuration of race in the 20th century. The legal institutionalization of Jim Crow and the modern nation accompanied 2 internal migrations that involved Black Americans who moved from the rural South to urban areas and white Americans who moved from the cities to the suburbs. In addition, important categories of economic expansion, war production, building suburbia, and highway construction largely excluded the employment of African Americans. By mid-20th century, the ghetto, the racial vernacular for degraded Black space, was the characteristic feature of Black urban isolation and concentration, and the suburbs represented the verdant exclusivity of whiteness. Both areas, urban Black neighborhoods and white suburbia, were products of racial zoning. The spatial landscape of race was achieved by several interlocking strategies of local, state, and federal cooperation. The New Deal of President Franklin Roosevelt encouraged federal funding to make home ownership available to a wider demographic of Americans. This new category of American modernity, suburban living, was facilitated by the Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, from 1933. The HOLC purchased, refinanced, and amortized mortgages over 15 to 25 years or more, including payments on the principal and interest and homeowners' accrued equity. The agency initiated and institutionalized home appraisal ratings based on race that were color-coded. And as you can see in this map, green was for the most expensive housing with homogeneous income and race, blue for the 2nd grade of residential areas, yellow was for the 3rd grade of mixed housing and commercial venues, and red or redlined areas, a color that was always associated from the period of slavery with race characteristics of hypersexual promiscuity, where Black Americans lived whose presence was considered inimical to whiteness. The Federal Housing Administration from 1934 insured bank mortgages for 80% of the purchase price for 20 years and fully amortized at low interest rates. It was a federal mortgage program that explicitly excluded Black Americans. Because Black homeowners could not secure most legitimate public or private mortgages at low interest rates, they suffered higher purchase prices and interest rates. When African Americans could not secure traditional mortgages, even at higher interest rates, contract buying was a predatory financial instrument in which African Americans paid higher monthly installments, but did not accrue equity and did not own the property until the last payment was made. The buyer was evicted and forfeited all funds paid if one payment was missed. Consequently, higher monthly payments for Black homeowners meant less resources for home improvements, and hence the condition of Black properties deteriorated. Banks and other lending institutions which relied on FHA insurance policies, appraisal ratings, and mortgages preferred making loans to suburban residential neighborhoods and disinvested in urban redlined areas. Racial zoning laws or ordinances in the early 20th century required racial residential segregation. In 1917, the Supreme Court ruled in Buchanan versus Worley that a Louisville, Kentucky housing ordinance for segregation violated the Due Process Clause of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 and the 14th Amendment. Nevertheless, local communities, building and real estate industries, and states across the nation established racial zoning laws, and the Federal Housing Administration enforced and funded those practices. Federal and private studies released in the 1980s and 1990s concluded that commercial and hazardous waste treatment facilities and incinerators were most likely located in or near Black residential areas. The placement of these polluting industries in African American neighborhoods contributed to their economic decline and disinvestment while protecting the property values of suburbia. Part of the National Democratic Party coalition in passing progressive New Deal legislation were Southern Democrats who demanded and received racial exclusion. Southern Democrats demanded and received racial exclusion in implementation in order to protect racial caste. The National Recovery Administration, the NRA of 1933, established industry-specific minimum wages and maximum hours, but excluded agricultural labor, farm workers, and domestic service employees, maids, which represented over 60% of African American employment. The Supreme Court outlawed the NRA in 1935, but many of its provisions were included in the National Labor Relations Act, or the Wagner Act of 1935, and the Fair Labor Standards Act. The original Wagner bill compelled labor unions to admit African Americans to membership and workplace rights in order to qualify for federal certification. The American Federation of Labor, the AFL, lobbied against the requirement, and it was removed. Hence, the Wagner Act enforced an unconstitutional policy that enabled labor unions to exclude African Americans from membership with no penalty. The federal government protected the collective bargaining rights of unions that violated African American citizenship rights. Yet it was not until 1964 that the National Labor Relations Board challenged all white unions, and not until the 1970s that Black labor was eligible for American Federation of Labor craft union membership. The Fair Labor Standards legislation of 1938, which provided a minimum wage, maximum hours, and time and a half for overtime, also excluded the occupations of maids and farm workers from wage and hours protections. But the most significant social policy of the New Deal was the Social Security Act of 1935. The provisions included pension security in old age, unemployment insurance, and old age assistance for the impoverished and dependent children. Yet this legislation also excluded agricultural labor and domestic service, the occupations that represented the majority of occupations for African Americans. Social Security payments began in 1940 when adequate funding had accrued for those enrolled. It was not until 1954, however, that the majority African American occupations were included in Social Security. But benefits depended on at least 5 years of wage contributions. Thus, African Americans did not participate in the first 25 years of the program, and their labor was exploited during periods of broad economic expansion. The New Deal legislation known as the GI Bill, or the Selective Service Readjustment Act of 1945, was a broad set of veterans' benefits to help them re-enter civilian culture after the war. The initiative provided tuition for college and graduate school, home mortgages insured by the Veterans Administration, business and farm loans, unemployment insurance, and job training. The language of the program was not racially exclusive, but administrative decisions for the distribution of benefits to veterans were supervised locally. African American veterans were entitled to the benefits of the GI Bill, but the program reproduced racial discrimination and disparity. This litany of 20th century racial discrimination, exploitation, and inequality in housing, social legislation, and income disadvantage reveals an American structural, systemic, and deliberate racism. We are reminded that our American exceptionalism is flawed and incomplete. My contribution to our Black Lives Teach-In call for action is dual. We must vote in this presidential election year, and we must try to build a more equitable nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gordon, for your presentation. If you are using Zoom today to access the event and have a question, please drop them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. We want to hear from you. Next, we have Bumi K. Thakor, who will be discussing the maintenance of racism and inequality in the capitalist society. The floor is yours, Dr. Thakor.
Good afternoon, everyone. I have a PowerPoint presentation I'd like to share. Let me go ahead and pull that up. I am on the I'm on the porch in my porch office, so apologies in advance if you hear any thunder. But I want to thank Brandon and Gunesh and Fawn for organizing this, and I'm really excited to be here today and learn from my colleagues. What I'd like to do today, what I'd like to contribute today is just some thoughts toward a more sociological understanding of why Blacks in the US are disproportionately oppressed in our society, dynamics having to do with things like generational wealth, generational racism, and certainly the structure of capitalism in our society, both an alienation from a capitalist system as well as a larger political process. So in my own framework and my own research, I focus on the power of dominant ideologies, and I pull from the larger sociological scholarship on this. First, the ideas of false consciousness, attributed first to Engels and then later to Marx and larger Marxist philosophy that describe the processes by which the oppressed embody the ideologies of the ruling elite. Gramsci was imprisoned by Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy during the early 1900s and wrote about the forces of hegemony and how they maintained dominant ideologies through cultural institutions, including the media. Stuart Hall examines how society is represented in our mass media by creators of content. In consumer media, this is unequivocally the owners of the primary sources of content, who are in place to serve as gatekeepers for the kinds of messages deemed important by the small 1%, or described by Mills as the power elite, the small group of corporate, political, and military leaders who dominate the US political agenda that has the authority to make decisions that protect their power, often at the expense of powerless groups. What is key to the maintenance of the power elite is their ability to cultivate a bourgeois class consciousness that also sinks into the proletariat mindset. This is why so many choose to politically align with candidates who do not have their best interests in mind when it comes to things like wages, employment, and access to opportunity. In the US, the policies of concentrated media ownership financially benefit corporate executives and perpetuate dominant ideologies. Media content reinforces stereotypes that perpetuate a bourgeois class consciousness, as well as those stereotypes about race, gender, class, other dynamics. We can understand the resonance of popular media messages that reinforce this false consciousness by looking back at history. In the period after the Civil War and Reconstruction, around 1890, we saw growth in particular areas around Virginia and Maryland, and in cities including New York, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. Later on, we saw similar kinds of growth in the West and other cities like Detroit, essentially those cities that were pulling in labor, particularly from the South. As these industrialized cities were diversifying, Blacks and whites were fighting for scarce jobs. Business owners were strategic in pitting these groups against each other and were able to do so with the wages they offered. White workers were paid just enough to get by without revolting, and Black workers had to settle for even less and for jobs under worse conditions. In professions, there were individual forms of discrimination within the ranks, as well as the structural barriers limiting opportunities to move up. Du Bois' 1899 book, The Philadelphia Negro, was a sociological examination of the Black urban experience during this time. On one end, the talented 10th were those intellectual elites who were able to tap into Black educational outlets. On the opposite end, the submerged 10th were so oppressed in their experiences of joblessness, as well as dealing with the related problems of poverty, homelessness, crime, addiction. Much of this had to do with the institutional legacies of slavery and the generational dynamics. Of course, we still see this today with segments of the Black population so oppressed in the ghettos of our major cities. Certainly the average 80% in the middle of these two extremes, particularly those who were also successful and simply wanted to succeed, were not able to do so due to the overt racism in their everyday experiences. This was due largely to the association by whites of all of the negative stereotypes associated with Blacks. This was at the root of race relations in the Jim Crow South and also informed dynamics in the North. Even during this period of immigration in these northern cities, we see groups like the Irish and Italians as being able to integrate into a larger white identity. Likely this was based on things like skin color, religion, but also other dynamics. We also see this in integrating cities through the examples of white riots against Blacks. There are countless examples of Black communities being torn down, and the example of Tulsa, as well as a number of riots that happened during the year of 1919. Another example is the Atlanta riots of 1906, which were based on unfounded claims that Black men were assaulting white women. It's interesting because the Atlanta riots happened right around the time that a particular performance, a play, was making the rounds through many of the major cities. The play was The Clansman, and it was essentially based on sort of a Ku Klux Klan fantasy, if you will. This play also was performed in Springfield, Missouri in 1906, and it was identified as one of the many reasons that there was riled up sentiment in that community against Blacks by the white workers. And of course, this was also being contributed to by the police, who were thriving in vagrancy laws and not arresting the whites for their crimes. This largely contributed to the ideology that if Blacks don't make money, they do not work hard enough. Again, that's failing to acknowledge limitations of the structure and access to employment. It also contributed to the ideology that Blacks are a threat in society. It reified the inherent stereotype that whites were threatening and the target are targeting Black, primarily fragile white women. These kinds of ideals were at the core of the rhetoric of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups. It became fundamental in the minds of whites to protect what was once theirs, and for a long time had nearly been all theirs. They've had the ability to physically and psychologically threaten people of color in all avenues, historically through racist protests, as well as in institutions like various employment opportunities, schools, etc. And this is primarily due to the fact that whites in America are feeling threatened. But when we look at sort of the roots of that threat, the arguments largely become about about labor, access to labor, and the fundamental exploitation of people within a capitalist structure. What helps to maintain it beyond the wages are the associated wages of whiteness, which is a level of privilege that even working class whites are able to access in society. It also creates a fallacy in the minds of Americans at all class levels. There's a sort of fallacy of class consciousness, particularly on the part of the middle class. We wonder if these things become not only just about labor, but also the idea of protecting whiteness, protecting a white identity, and a response, a major response to the inequality that whites are perceiving due to this sort of access to resources in the capitalist system. So how can we understand social change to move away or move toward a solution? Primarily, I think we need to address the byproducts of this sort of inequality at the class level. Not only the instabilities of access to jobs and everything that comes after that, but again, the police brutality that's a result of this sort of ingrained hatred toward Blacks in our society. Again, social change is hinged on fundamental policy changes that can make these things possible, that can move resources in the direction that they need to go. And of course, understanding how all of this is going to be impacted amid COVID-19 as dynamics are changing, especially as we think about protests toward defunding the police and those dynamics, and other specific examples that are fueling the protests right now, and understanding what policies can be put in place to listen to some of those unanswered requests. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Takor, for your presentation. Once again, we want to hear from you. If you have questions about Dr. Takor or Dr. Gordon's lessons, please drop them in the Q&A section, and I will be asking those questions at the end of this session. Next, we will hear from Dr. Carrie Watson, who will be discussing the American carceral landscape and the perpetuation of slavery. The floor is yours, Dr. Watson.
Thank you, Brandon. And thank you to my fellow panelists and to Ganesh, Afan, and Tiffany for organizing this event. Just gonna share my screen. Okay. Great. I'm Carrie Watson, an associate professor of art history in the School of Visual Arts and Design and the curator of an upcoming National Endowment for the Arts sponsored exhibition, Illuminating the Darkness, Our Carceral Landscape. I first taught in a prison as part of the Alabama Prison Arts and Education Project in 2012, and I started the Florida Prison Education Project here at UCF in 2017. So in my presentation today, I'd like to offer a brief outline of the ways in which slavery and incarceration are inextricably linked, and to discuss the ways in which the American carceral system perpetuates structural racism. Okay. An estimated 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States. And although just 13.4% of the national population identifies as African American, 40% of the US incarcerated population is Black. 1 in 3 African American men can expect to serve time in prison, as opposed to 1 in 17 white men. And of the 2,620 people on death row in the United States today, 1,087 are Black. Prosecutors are more than 3 times as likely to seek the death penalty in cases where the victim is white and the perpetrator is Black. And in 2016, 80% of the people on death row in Duval County, which is Jacksonville, Florida, were African American. According to a recent study by the National Academy of Sciences, police violence is a leading cause of death for young men in the United States, and Black men are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police than are white men. The racial disparity evidenced in these statistics is not surprising given the history of policing and prisons in the US. The exploitation and commodification of enslaved African labor was crucial to the development of the nation, as enslaved labor not only supported the Southern plantation economy, but also built the US Capitol, the White House, and Wall Street. Although industrialization and the abolishment of the slave trade in 1807 led to a decline in the number of people enslaved in the American North, between 1830 and 1850, 1 million enslaved Africans were either imported to the American South from the West Indies. Did it stop sharing?
Yes, you need to reshare. It went black.
Reshare. Okay.
There you go. You're good now.
Thank you. Between 1830 and 1850, 1 million enslaved Africans were either imported to the American South from the West Indies or born into slavery in the US, constituting what scholars call a second slavery. Moreover, US police forces, as historian Edward L. Ayres notes, were largely developed to capture runaway slaves and control indigenous populations. The Civil War and the Emancipation Proclamation did not end American slavery either. The 13th Amendment allowed slavery to continue as punishment for crime. And in Slavery by Another Name, Douglas Blackman points out that African Americans were arrested by the thousands after the Civil War as vagrancy laws and black codes that criminalized mischief, loitering, and curfew breaking were passed. Many Southern prisons, such as Parchman in Mississippi and Angola in Louisiana, were built on the sites of former plantations. And today, Angola is the largest maximum security prison in the United States, housing more than 6,000 men, 75% of whom are Black. As noted by David Oshinsky in Worse Than Slavery, during Reconstruction, incarceration grew at a rate 10 times faster than that of the general population, as prisoners became younger and Blacker, and the length of their sentences soared. At the same time, as noted by historian Alexandra Minna-Stern, medicine became increasingly racialized during the postbellum period, and many African Americans were incarcerated in state-run psychiatric hospitals, even if they displayed no signs of mental illness. Following the increased demand for institutionalization brought on by prejudicial medical diagnoses and societal discrimination, states built residential hospitals at a rapid rate, and 28 states adopted statutes that legalized compulsory sterilization. Sterilization rates were highest among African Americans, and involuntary sterilizations, or Mississippi appendectomies, as civil rights activist Fannie Lou Hamer famously called them, were regularly performed on women of color. Between 1850 and 1928, African Americans were regularly arrested for petty crimes and then sold by the state into forced labor to pay their debts. The passage of the Penal Servitude Acts in the 1850s allowed private corporations to lease incarcerated laborers from the state and use them in farming, railroad construction, mining, and logging. And you can see in this photo, these are youth. People who were rounded up, and probably not even offenders, but just orphans who became wards of the state and then were used in forced labor. In 1878, Georgia leased out 1,239 prisoners, 1,124 of whom were African American. And in South Carolina, in the 1870s, the death rate of prisoners leased to railroad companies was 45%. Although the convict lease system was officially abolished across the country by 1928, forced labor of incarcerated people continues. Today, most prisons rely on unpaid labor, and incarcerated workers in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, and Texas are not paid. In 2008, a Mexican company closed its factory and relocated it to San Quentin State Prison in California. And in Texas, a factory fired 150 non-incarcerated workers to contract the services of prisoner workers in the privately run for-profit Lockhart, Texas prison. These men assemble circuit boards for IBM and Compaq for less than $1 an hour. In 2007, former Oregon State Representative Kevin Minix urged Nike to close its factories in Indonesia and bring its production inside Oregon prisons. Private corporations not only lease factories in state-run prisons, but they also run their own for-profit prisons. Between 2000 and 2016, the number of people incarcerated in private prison facilities increased 47%, while the overall prison population increased just 9%. Assaults in private prisons can occur at double the rate found at public facilities, and because for-profit prison companies exist to make money, the number of people convicted of crimes and sent to prison impacts their bottom line. This was summarized by the Corrections Corporation of America in their 2010 annual report, which reads, quote, "Our growth is generally dependent upon our ability to obtain new contracts to develop and manage new correctional and detention facilities. This possible growth depends on a number of factors we cannot control, including crime rates and sentencing patterns in various jurisdictions and acceptance of privatization. The demand for our facilities and services could be adversely affected by the relaxation of enforcement efforts, leniency in conviction or parole standards, and sentencing practices, or through the decriminalization of certain activities, like drugs, that are currently prescribed by our criminal laws," close quote. In order to overcome these challenges, private prison companies have advocated for longer sentences and support for privatization by joining with the American Legislative Exchange Council, or ALEC. Law enforcement and sentencing policy changes dated to the tough on crime era and the demand to fill beds caused by privatization of prisons has led to a 500% increase in the national incarceration rate over the last 40 years. Since the beginning of the war on drugs in the 1980s, the number of people incarcerated for drug offenses has skyrocketed. Although, as Elizabeth Hinton notes, mass incarceration and the war on crime also owe a significant debt to the war on poverty. Today, states that offer the least in the way of social services, such as Louisiana, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas, Texas, and Florida, also have the highest incarceration rates in the nation. And as Michelle Alexander argues in The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Color-blindness, mass incarceration is a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racialized social control. Policing policies and incarceration are inextricably linked to the subjugation of the Black body and the history of slavery in the United States, the culmination of which is the continued exertion of white supremacy. I'd like to close with the words of Ta-Nehisi Coates, who writes, "The truth is that the police reflect America in all of its will and fear, and whatever we might make of this country's criminal justice policy, it cannot be said that it was imposed by a repressive minority. The abuses that have followed from these policies, the sprawling carceral state, the random detention of Black people, the torture of suspects, are the product of democratic will. To acknowledge these horrors means turning away from the brightly rendered version of your country as it has always declared itself. It is still too difficult for most Americans to do this, but this is your work." Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Watson, for that presentation. Closing, Our first session will be Dr. Kenesia Wright, who will be discussing representative bureaucracy, intersectionality, and female health outcomes in the U.S. The floor is yours, Dr. Wright.
Thank you so much, Brandon. So I will share my screen with everyone. And I'll talk a little bit about representative bureaucracy, intersectionality, and female health outcomes in the U.S. As Brandon mentioned, my name is Dr. Wright. I'm currently an assistant professor at the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs here at UCF, and I thank you all so much for tuning into this teach-in on a very important topic. So it's completely okay if you've never heard of representative bureaucracy, intersectionality before. We'll talk about that in the coming slides. I'll start by discussing health outcomes in the US, which I think is something that all of us have at least some level of understanding on. A few points about health in the US. So the US spends more on healthcare than most nations in the entire world. Despite spending a lot of money on healthcare, most Americans have poor health outcomes. There's a history of this pattern, although we hear a lot of discussion in relation to COVID-19, sort of disproportionately impacting people of color. There's a history of this pattern. This isn't a recent occurrence. This isn't something that's just reflective in the health outcomes of Americans due to COVID-19. So what explains this pattern? Well, scholars have studied many different factors, including the role of income and education in shaping health outcomes. But the existing explanations offer limited insight on health differences or health disparities across important social identities such as gender, race, and ethnicity. So these major differences across these social identities make it important to examine what factors contribute to improved health. So today I'll be talking a little bit about the extent to which female healthcare workers improve female health outcomes. The specific research questions I'm going to be examining: do we see a benefit from female healthcare workers? And if so, do we see their impact having the same effect on the health of white women and women of color? So what is the theory of representative bureaucracy? This is commonly used in public administration research and political science research. The main idea here is that when we have frontline workers that look like their patients, we generally see improvements in patient outcomes. The theory of representative bureaucracy has been studied in the educational context and the criminal justice realm. It doesn't receive a lot of attention in the healthcare realm, but essentially what this would mean is if we have more female nurses, more female doctors, more female surgeons, more female healthcare workers, then we would expect the female outcomes in the US to improve. Intersectionality is important to this discussion because it really raises the idea that social inequality can exist along multiple social identities. So we shouldn't just be paying attention to how female healthcare workers impact the health of women. We should consider how women of color and white women may be differently impacted. The idea of intersectionality, because social identities overlap, right? I am a Black woman, I have more than one social identity that can shape my lived experience. It becomes important to consider how race and gender can shape health outcomes in the US. Despite this sort of extensively being studied, right? Theory of representative bureaucracy and intersectionality gaining attention in all types of research across different disciplines, we rarely see these two ideas put together to offer insight on health outcomes. So that's what I'll be doing in this particular project. Here is the overview of the entire project. In essence, I make the argument that a more representative workforce, right, more female healthcare providers should contribute to improved outcomes of all women in the US. Hypotheses 2A and 2B really center on whether or not we're going to see differences along race and ethnicity. This is the intersectional component. H2A, I argue that we would expect female health outcomes to improve, but that white women are going to benefit more than Black women, largely because most of the female healthcare workers in the US are white women themselves. H2B, similar framework, only I'm focusing on the impact of female healthcare workers on Latinas. Study details. In essence, to sort of recap everything all together, I'm studying how female healthcare providers impact the health outcomes of white women, Black women, and Latinas. I'll be focusing specifically on the impact of these female healthcare workers on preterm birth rates. I'll look at preterm birth rates across all United States, and I'll be studying this particular relationship from 2000 to 2012. To spare you the pain of going through a graduate level education on research methods, I'll summarize the main points in this table. So this table is reflecting all of the results of those three relationships I mentioned. So how female healthcare workers impact white women, how female healthcare workers impact Black women, and how these workers impact the preterm birth rates of Latinas. So all this table is showing is that as we have more female healthcare workers, we see a reduction in the preterm birth rates of white women in the US and Black women in the US. So this aligns with the expectations I have. There are really important benefits to having female healthcare workers, but we see the importance of intersectionality as all women are not impacted the same. White women are impacted in a direct way, as are Black women, but we see there aren't any significant effects here. This means I can't reach a confident conclusion that increasing female healthcare workers will have any meaningful effect on the preterm birth rates of Latinas. This again highlights the importance of studying the theory of representative bureaucracy and intersectionality when we're trying to understand health outcomes in the US. So the call to action. So hopefully this gives you some insight on what the theory of representative bureaucracy is, what intersectionality is, and how we can combine them to offer significant insights. But what's the straightforward implications? What does this mean and how does it impact you all? I think it highlights that you all should pursue careers where people who may look like you are underrepresented. You want to make sure you're getting information, seeking mentors, listening to people who may have different experiences than you, because as these results suggest, race and ethnicity and gender intersect to have really unique effects on people in the US. And take action. To echo the call earlier, I encourage all of you to engage in politics, participate in politics. If there are topics that you don't know anything about or would like to learn more about, whether it's reparations, capitalism, redlining, structural racism, for-profit, prisons, any of the topics that we've discussed today, disparities in health, disparities more broadly, I encourage you all to get information, seek others, listen to others, and again, be engaged in politics. I'll conclude with my contact information, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you all may have during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Wright. This brings us to the end of the first mini session, and now we are going to take questions. Once again, these questions are coming from those that are using Zoom, and put the questions in the Q&A. Our first question will be directed towards all of our panelists, starting first with Dr. Gordon and continuing in the order of the presentations. The first question states, and this is from Anonymous, the Black church has been a pillar of society. In what ways are they part of the problem? And in what ways can they be a part of the solution now? And like I said, we'll start with Dr. Gordon.
Okay, thank you, Brandon. That's such an interesting question. But certainly I think one of the ways that the Black church can participate in the call to action at this particular moment certainly is in encouraging its congregations to vote, again, in this presidential election year, to register to vote, and then to go and vote, as well as certainly the church can be a site for investigating and discussing these disparities in American life and how Black Americans can address them.
Okay, Dr. Thakor. Dr. Thakor, are you with us still? Okay, let me move on to we'll hear from Dr. Thakor in a minute. We'll move on to Dr. Watson.
So the issue of the church and the response, is that the question about the Black church in particular?
Yes, let me go back and reread the question here.
Thank you.
It states, so the Black church has been a pillar of society. In what ways are they a part of the problem? In what ways can they be a part of the solution now?
Wow. Well, I don't really study the church specifically, so I can't answer that question as a scholar. I mean, I've read a little bit about, I suppose, the church and am active in the church, but yeah, I think it is an organization like any institution, like universities, all institutions, they have problems and perpetuate issues. I guess that would be all I could really say on that topic.
Okay. And we'll give it to Dr. Wright.
Excellent question. So not to sort of reiterate the points that have already been spoken, but I think when we think of the role of the Black church in shaping either political engagement, political knowledge, civic engagement more broadly, it has a critical role. I think when we're sort of talking about it potentially being a problem and solution, there's an extensive amount of research on this idea of social capital. So how people develop connections, how they develop networks, how they develop important connections that can have important effects on educational outcomes, health outcomes, inequalities in society, and can even mobilize people to be engaged in politics. So I would say to that sort of extent, the role of the Black church in addressing some of these issues, similar to the point that was mentioned earlier, encouraging congregation members to vote, be engaged, making sure the public is aware of differences in, for example, COVID-19 being disproportionately impacting people of color, being aware of these different sort of issues that are important at the local level, at the state level, and at the national level. I think the Black church remains a relevant, important institution in informing and connecting people. There are many ways that it can do it. I definitely agree that the sort of seminal history, the history of the Black church and encouraging individuals to be engaged in politics is definitely not understated with elections. And I think it can also continue to serve as a way for people to connect and group with others.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Wright. And this next question I want to ask Dr. Watson. And this question says, this is coming from Lauren Fessler. And they said, what can be done to shut down efforts of private prison systems?
Oh, well, I mean, I think my largest call to action is to vote and to get involved in the process, right? To exert action to shut down groups like ALEC. But we have a system with a lot of political action committees, so grassroots organizing to try to fight the powers that are on the other side, right, arguing for privatization. And it's really difficult, right, because we have this whole notion or this prevailing mythology, I think, for a lot of people that government is bad and private enterprise and businessmen somehow can do it better. But I certainly don't think that it is the role or the responsibility of for-profit businesses to be involved in law enforcement. I think that the privatization of prisons goes along with the militarization of our police force, and these are highly problematic, right? Some things we need to be the responsibility of the people for other people. So I don't have an example of a particular organization to get involved in, but I think to look around, to look for supporting candidates for office who are against the privatization of prisons. Write letters to your representatives that you don't support the privatization of prisons. Write letters to abolish the prison system in general. I swayed a little bit there from my argument, but.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Watson. And I want to go back to you, Dr. Gordon. This question is for you specifically. It says, would you explain what redlining is again and how Reconstruction helped create some of the housing issues for people of color today?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we hear you.
Redlining was a system initiated in the New Deal in 1933, the Homeowners Loan Corporation. In the period after the Civil War, actually from the 1870s and 1880s, most Americans who lived in cities were more integrated, or certainly there was more racial integration than there was at mid-20th century. And certainly one of the reasons for that was because of redlining. But redlining was a way of saying, this is where Black people live. If you lived in a green area, that represented the most elite and expensive housing. The blue areas represented the next economic group. They were middle class. The yellow areas also represented mixed housing, multiple family housing, as well as commercial establishments. But again, most of those living in all three of those areas, the yellow, the blue and green, were white Americans. African Americans only lived in redlined areas, or it was an attempt to delineate where African Americans lived in any particular locality. And wherever they lived, then no mortgages were made to them, nor were they able to secure insurance on their properties. So all of those things contributed to the decline, and certainly banks and other lending institutions disinvested in those areas, but they did make investments in those other three color-coded and racially coded areas of green, blue, and yellow. So did I answer that question?
Yes, yes, you did. And thank you for that.
Part? Okay.
Yeah, that was it, Dr. Gordon.
Okay.
And so so that wraps up, what a way to wrap it up there for the first session. So we're going to move right on into the next session here. So thank you once again to our first group of panelists for their time and their presentations. And now we're going to start our second session, and we have an excellent lineup. I'm going to introduce them right here. Starting with Dr. Jonathan Cox, Assistant Professor in the Department of Sociology. Then we will hear from Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant, Assistant Professor from the Department of Anthropology. After that, we will hear from Dr. Connie Lester, Associate Professor from the Department of History. And wrapping up our last session will be none other than Dr. Amelia Lyons, Associate Professor from the Department of History. Once again, thank you to our presenters. And now I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Cox, who will be discussing colorblindness is racism, and white supremacy. Take it over, Dr. Cox.
Awesome, thank you. All right, thank you very much. I definitely appreciate the opportunity to join this panel. This is really great. Thanks again to Ganesh, Fawn, and Tiffany for putting this all together and for this invitation. I've really been enjoying a lot of what my colleagues have been saying. I hope that I can add a little bit to this. And so, just to introduce what I'm going to talk about a little bit, again, what I really want to do, very briefly, obviously, is just reframe our idea of colorblindness, right? Many people, particularly white Americans, they think of being colorblind with regards to race as a very good thing, right? A positive thing. For many of these people, right, it's very well-intentioned, right? The idea actually sounds pretty laudable if you think about it, right? If you don't see race, then you're gonna treat everybody the same regardless of what race they are. But unfortunately, it doesn't actually work like that. And so my goal today, in the few short minutes that I have, is just to argue that colorblindness is actually a racial project that perpetuates racism, and perpetuates racial inequalities and maintains white supremacy. So let's get this screen share going. All right. So again, I just wanted to, this is the main idea of what I hope to get over, to talk through with you all today. So I'll start by just overviewing racial project a little bit, as I'm trying to suggest that colorblindness is a racial project. And so racial projects come out of this idea that Michael Omi and Howard Wynant created a while ago, right? They coined the term racial projects. They said that racial projects are simultaneously an interpretation, representation, or explanation of various racial dynamics, as well as an effort to reorganize and redistribute resources along particular racial lines, right? And so what this means then is that racial projects are, one, they're intentional, right? They are purposefully created. And then two, they're created to have tangible, real world impact on people based on race, right? Racial projects, again, they're meant to reorganize and redistribute resources along racial lines. And so we can think about a few different examples of what racial projects are, right? So one, defining Native Americans and indigenous peoples as savages, right? The outcome of this racial project is the justification of their violent removal from lands, right? We also could look at labeling Black women as welfare queens, right? So the outcome of this as a racial project is that Black women are then seen as being undeserving of public assistance. Another big one that we could think about is the war on drugs, right? The outcome of the war on drugs, if we view it as a racial project, was that there was a range of legislative and punitive policies that resulted in the increased policing and incarceration of Black people, right? Particularly Black men. And so, again, as I'm saying, I'm presenting today just this idea that colorblind racial ideology or colorblindness is itself a racial project. And as a racial project, the outcome of colorblindness, it really shifts discussions away from race as a central feature of our society, and it results in the maintenance of white privilege and the racial status quo. And so just to give you a little bit of what colorblindness is, right? Colorblindness has been, essentially it's been the dominant racial ideology in the United States since the Civil Rights era, right? It's based on a structural formation of racism. And as such, it relies on the idea that race is no longer a significant factor in social life. And in fact, what we see through colorblindness is that race is removed as a meaningful identity almost altogether, right? And in this manner, many people, but in particular white Americans, believe that racial discrimination just no longer exists because it's now outlawed, right? This means that policies then that were meant to overturn the effects of generational racism and racial inequalities are seen as unfair, unnecessary, all these things, right? So you can start to see how this could be problematic. And so here's just some of the different ways in which people use colorblind ideology. And this actually refers to some of the frames that sociologist Eduardo Bonilla Silva came up with when he was doing a lot of research on colorblindness. So one thing we end up seeing through colorblindness is that people use ideas like equal opportunity or individual choice and arguments for meritocracy in very abstract ways to explain away racial matters. And so when people frame issues in these ways, these abstract ways, it allows folks to sound reasonable while at the same time opposing practical solutions to racial inequality. And so a perfect example would be affirmative action, right? People suggest that affirmative action represents an unfair preferential treatment for people of color. But unfortunately, this isn't based in an accurate understanding of affirmative action, right? It ignores the historical and present day realities that result in significant underrepresentation of people of color in almost every aspect of business and education, or the fact that white women are actually the largest benefactors of affirmative action, right? And so in similar ways to this, people who tout meritocracy often ignore the fact that the majority of people who are rewarded for their hard work are actually white people, right? So you see this missing link in terms of how people are understanding it when you filter things through colorblindness. Second, people suggest that some racial issues are just natural occurrences, right? Like segregation, right? They'll say things like, well, people just feel more comfortable around other people that are like them. It's just human nature. Now, the problem, however, is that things don't just happen, right? People do things, they do things to other people. And this type of a perspective just really ignores these social processes that create our world, right? For instance, people are segregated. They don't segregate themselves. People self-segregate ignores a system that clearly benefits certain individuals based on their group membership, right? In this case, race. Another thing we end up seeing through colorblindness is that people suggest that Americans of color are responsible for their own problems, right? They don't put in the right level of effort, or they have inappropriate values or misplaced priorities. And this is really just a form of blaming the victim, right? It's predicated on false information. For example, a common stereotype is that Black people don't want to do as well in school because they're afraid of being labeled as acting white. But in reality, research actually shows that Black students have higher academic aspirations and higher academic drive than their white peers even, and that they often reject the idea that academic achievement is associated with being white. Now, finally, people also minimize racism and discrimination, right? They admit that it exists, but it's not really a significant problem. Now, a popular way of doing this is when people say things like, well, look at Obama, right? He's Black, he became president. There's no reason that Black people can't work hard and achieve. Now, again, this ignores all of the evidence that shows that no matter how hard Black people work, they still face discrimination and racism that inhibits success. Also, the fact that President Obama was a very privileged Black man, right? He's not the norm or the average what we see with regards to Black people in the United States. Minimization of racism also occurs through the accusation that people of color are pulling the race card, right? That they're making things about race unnecessarily. So this is just a little bit of an overview of what colorblindness is and how it works. And so you can start to see then how this becomes a racial project. And so again, if we start to dig into colorblindness in this way, what we can see is that colorblindness in reality really only serves to maintain white racial dominance. And it does so by negating racial inequality and discrimination, right? And this really is the essence of white supremacy. And I know what comes to mind for most people when you say white supremacy is overtly racist, far-right extremism, right? KKK members, neo-Nazis, maybe even the white men who marched with tiki torches in Charlottesville. These are definitely white supremacist organizations and people, but at the base of white supremacy is just a continuance of white domination, right? It really doesn't matter how you get there, be it through espoused beliefs or intentional actions, or through more passive acceptance of a structure that maintained dominance, like colorblindness, right? Colorblindness gets us to the same ending that some of these other much more overt forms of white supremacy we see happening, right? And so, colorblindness is ideology. It's not about identifying people as good or bad or as racist, right? What's actually more important to focus on in terms of racism is seeing racism as systemic and structural, right? That's how you can start to then see how colorblindness impacts the mechanisms and collective practices that operate to perpetuate the racial status quo, right? To keep white Americans on top in the dominant position. And in this way, individuals and their beliefs are far less important than the ideological practices that uphold our racialized system. In fact, many of the people who use colorblind racial ideology, particularly whites, right, they don't actually believe that they're perpetuating racism in any way. In fact, many of them believe that they're actively not racist, right? Although clearly for some people, this is much more of an erroneous belief than others. Now, again, no matter how well-intentioned colorblindness can be or can seem, right, it really just serves to perpetuate racial inequalities and white dominance, right? It helps us to further ignore things, right? Again, if you don't see race, then you don't see racism, right? You can't address anything with some of these major issues. And so if we can really help people understand how colorblindness works in these ways, we can actually be much more effective at actually addressing racism, racial inequalities, the things that we need to do something about, right? So essentially what we need is everybody to abandon this colorblindness, this colorblind ideology that keeps trying to be perpetuated throughout our society, and instead actually work to the opposite, right? Focus on being actively color conscious, right? And that's actually the first step towards being anti-racist. And so I would like to encourage you all to really push this type of awareness forward, right? In your own life, think about how you may be perpetuating colorblindness and thus white dominance, as well as the lives of your friends and other people that you see. So that's it. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Cox. And I want to remind everyone again that if you are using Zoom to access today's event and have a question about Dr. Cox's presentation or any of the presenters coming up, please put it in the Q&A section of the chat. Next, we will hear from Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant, and he will be discussing Archaeology is anti-racist or it is nothing, confronting the legacies of anti-Black pogroms in 2020. The floor is yours, Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is that visible? I hope that's visible and you can see it. As the title of my talk suggests, I'm an archaeologist who studies anti-Black violence in Florida. And I do this through an intersectional lens to make sense of the multidimensionality of violence in America, past and present. Much of my work examines the history of Rosewood, Florida. The destruction of Rosewood in 1923 is part of a much larger history of America's struggle to accept difference. I want to begin by recognizing my own discipline's role in this larger history. Archaeology is a part of anthropology, and anthropologists spied for colonizers. We barred minorities from conducting research. We desecrated graves and contributed to an emerging eugenics movement. Today, many of us acknowledge this history while working for a better world. Archaeologists have a saying that archaeology is anthropology or it is nothing. Now, this was a call to make archaeology scientific and focus our research on culture instead of fetishizing artifacts or bones. This cultural aspect is vital to creating an anti-racist archaeology. Dr. Ibram Kendi discusses 3 zones encountered as one works to confront anti-racism or become an anti-racist. A fear zone where discomfort with hard questions and difference prohibits growth. If we push past this, a learning zone involves the understanding that racism remains a problem, that many of us have privilege, and a need to listen to others while facing our own biases and educating ourselves about the history of racism. As we continue, we may reach a growth zone. This centers on identifying our relationships with racism, especially important for those who benefit from structural racism, and dealing with the discomfort we may face when encountering difference. Also, we have to speak against racism, do the hard work of learning from our mistakes, yielding power to the marginalized, and finding ways of honestly engaging difference. I've had the privilege to spend long periods of time in settings as an anthropologist where I'm not part of the majority. However, if I was in that setting as a researcher, I also recognize the difficulty of not letting any privilege that position may provide me from turning into entitlement. I believe most of us here today are seeking to move beyond the fear zone. A fuller knowledge of anti-Black violence helps us with this learning zone. Understanding the cultural aspects of it can hopefully support work from the growth zone as well. Now, I can summarize the rest of my talk very easily. White America either directly or implicitly supports anti-Black violence. How, as a scientist, do I arrive at such a statement? Rosewood is located less than 10 miles from the Gulf of Mexico in Levy County, Florida. Initially settled by a handful of white families prior to the Civil War, it eventually became a stop on the first cross-state railroad. Following the Civil War, a handful of African Americans purchased property, and by 1900, the town was a majority Black community boasting dozens of families, several businesses, numerous churches, and a public school. Rosewood was a prosperous town, not because its residents were exceedingly wealthy, but because they owned their homes, worked for African American owned businesses, owned their own businesses, and educated their children at rates far higher than their white community neighbors. This was violently torn from them during the first week of 1923. A white mob, which began as a group of deputized citizens, grew in size over the week. They terrorized Rosewood, eventually killing several residents before burning Black-owned structures and displacing the entire community. These families spent decades building intergenerational wealth. In a week, it was all lost. Archaeology is vital in places like Rosewood. It offers us a glimpse into the everyday lives of the families who live there. We know from archaeological evidence that residents of Rosewood had a quality of life similar or even better than their white neighbors. In fact, time and time again, archaeologists working on sites from the 19th and 20th centuries faced their biases that no significant material differences existed between Blacks and white neighbors at sites excavated across the nation. The time period between the end of World War I and the early 1920s was particularly violent. Some forms of violence, when analyzed separately, give the appearance of lessening racial tensions. For instance, the numbers of lynchings dropped during this time. However, as the numbers decreased, their brutality grew, giving rise to the spectacle lynchings when thousands of white Americans would crowd into city centers to ritualistically kill and dismember Black bodies in a carnivalesque manner. Race riots dramatically increased during this time, what myself and others refer to as pogroms because of their intended goal of displacing African American communities. 30 or more pogroms or riots occurred in metropolitan areas during the summer of 1919 alone. In East St. Louis, the National Guard was called in to halt rioting, only to participate in it themselves. The Chicago and Omaha riots of 1919 involved whites rioting with little cause for days, attacking and burning Black neighborhoods indiscriminately. In Tulsa, 40 square blocks were burned. the violence escalated to the point where local whites chartered small planes to drop incendiary devices on Black homes. As the 20th century wore on, the disenfranchisement of African Americans wrought by structural violence resulted in moments when violent protests erupted. These riots as protests typically resulted when law enforcement killed innocent, unarmed, and/or underage individuals. The similarities between events like the 1973 Dallas protests following the killing of 12-year-old Santos Rodriguez echoes more recent events like the killing of Trayvon Martin here in Florida. These forms of interpersonal violence were further supported by structural and symbolic forms of violence. The growth of sundown towns, initially a reaction against Asian and Hispanic groups in the US West, quickly spread across the country. The practice of creating all-white towns or violently displacing minorities reached its apex in the 1970s in the Midwest. The effects of the sundown town movement and similar things like redlining are still noticeable today in the stark differences between racial populations in places like Orlando and across the nation. Symbolic violence included Hollywood cinema, which contributed to the representation of African American men as violent and hypersexual, roaming a rural countryside in search of innocent white women to assault, tropes that survive to this day. Simultaneously, the eugenics movement represented African Americans in the southern states as, and I'm quoting, so genetically inferior as to be hopelessly lost to improvement. These representations were common features from the local cinema to state and national newspapers. A transformation has occurred regarding racial violence in this country, but not the one we're hoping for. Whereas interpersonal violence was a common tool of white supremacy a century ago, today our nation relies on state violence, like police brutality, and various forms of structural and symbolic violence to restrict Black lives. Rural Black towns have largely disappeared from the American landscape. Researchers who examine these histories find thousands, more than 500 in Texas alone. If property is wealth, then white America has either directly or implicitly supported the unfair seizure of this wealth from Black lands for decades, if not centuries. So each of us were asked to prepare a takeaway or action item. Mine involves 3 steps. First, acknowledge the challenges facing many African American communities today. 2 of the big ones are over-policing and poverty. Second, support officials who address these issues. The police do not need millions of dollars worth of military equipment. Do not arm our police for war. The equation is simple. Shift that money towards programs that address poverty. Give people food. Give them places to sleep. Few of us know how hard it is to live for years without a single night of sleep. Use money to fix that. And then finally, and perhaps most importantly for each of us today in the here and now, until these changes are made, spend money in these communities. Go online and find lists of Black authors, Black restaurants, or other Black-owned businesses. Shop at sites like WeBuyBlack.com. Put money into these communities. No single solution will solve these issues, but each of us can start somewhere right now. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant. Up next, we have one of my professors from graduate school and my thesis advisor, Dr. Connie Lester, who will be discussing the rhyme of history, racism in the Florida narrative. The floor is yours, Dr. Lester.
Thank you. And I want to thank the previous presenters and for the organizers of this event. It's been spectacular. As I was preparing for this event, I was reminded of Mark Twain's observation that history does not repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And you can see the rhyme of history in Florida in the violence that has been perpetuated from the beginnings of the state, from the 3 Seminole Wars right up through Trayvon Martin. And so I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about the ways in which violence has been a part of this state's history. In the aftermath of slavery, whites worked rigorously to reassert white supremacy and to limit the opportunities for African Americans. And they did that in a number of ways, through violence and intimidation, through segregation of public spaces and disfranchisement, through the limitations of economic opportunities. And we've heard quite a bit about that today. In the period from 1877 to 1950, careful historians have recognized that there were some 4,000 lynchings that occurred in the United States, most of which took place in the South. Florida was 5th in the number of lynchings with 331. And that's misleading in many ways because you were more likely to be lynched in Florida than you were in Mississippi. Florida's population was the smallest east of the Mississippi River. And so those 331 lynchings represent a rate that was much higher than for other states. Florida was first in that category. Of the 25 counties with the most lynchings in the United States, 6 were in Florida: Orange, Marion, Alachua, Polk, Columbia, and Taylor counties. In focusing on violence, I want to focus on the violence in Orange County because that's closest to us. We know about this. The Ocoee Massacre, which occurred in the period from November the 2nd to the early pre-dawn hours of November the 4th, 1920, took an estimated 30 to 60 lives. It was one of the most violent episodes in American political and election history. Originally called a riot because by calling it a riot, it put the burden of the event on African Americans, but it's more properly a massacre. It was a massacre by whites of African Americans in the village of Ocoee. Ocoee was a prosperous farming village, much like Rosewood in that regard. About 1,000 people lived there, half of them white, half of them black. The geography of Ocoee tells us something about the riot because the Black community was divided into 2 parts. Part of the Black community lived on the north side of Ocoee around the AME church, and part of the community lived on the south side of Ocoee around the Baptist church that was there. It separated the community and had different outcomes for the 2 sides of the community. The people who lived in Ocoee, the African Americans who lived in Ocoee, came from 2 different sources as well. Some had been brought to the area in the days of slavery, and others had migrated to the area after the Civil War, looking for economic opportunity. They came from South Carolina and Alabama and Georgia, and they found economic opportunity. People like the Perrys, the Normans, the Hightowers, and the Hamilton family did well. They owned their own land. They owned their own homes. They produced truck crops and citrus, and they did well. They were members of religious organizations, of fraternal organizations. July Perry, who figures prominently in this story, was deacon of his church. He was also a member of the Black Masons. He was prominent in his community. He was prominent in the area because he controlled Black labor from Ocoee in the citrus groves. And that went against the principles of white supremacy. White supremacy wanted to control Black labor and work to control Black labor. But in Ocoee, July Perry controlled Black labor, and that created tensions. There were other tensions in the community as well. Tensions that were caused by the resurgence of hate language and violence that came as the result of actions outside the community and outside Orange County in some cases. The rise of the Second Klan moved hate and moved white supremacy from the back burner to the front burner in a real sense. It appealed to middle-class whites. There were counties that in their county fair had Klan Day. This happened in Florida. It happened outside the South as well. Politicians became members of the Klan. Ministers of the church became members of the Klan. Members of the police force were members of the Klan. And they were openly members of the Klan. The Klan marched periodically in various cities across the South and the nation. In the immediate months before the election of 1920, there were marches by the Klan in both Orlando and Daytona. And people were aware of this. The purpose of the marches in part was to intimidate Blacks, to keep them from voting. There were political issues as well that affected Orange County in 1920. Blacks in Florida had determined that they were going to push the right to vote. They had been disfranchised through poll taxes and through other ways, but always there were a few who were able to vote. And they decided that they would get out the vote in a really big way in 1920. So fraternal organizations encouraged their members to register and to be ready to vote. The Knights of Pythias made it a qualification for membership in the organization that you be registered to vote. And there was a concerted effort to get out the vote. The thinking was if they were able to vote, that would have an impact on life around them. But if they were denied the right to vote, even after they had met all of the qualifications, then they had an opportunity to bring a lawsuit or to encourage Congress to investigate voting rights in the South. And that was the plan. This was complicated, though, in 1920, because in August of 1920, women were enfranchised as well with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. White suffragists in the South had argued that if they were enfranchised, they would help to secure white supremacy because there would be more white women voters than Black women voters. Black women voters had encouraged the suffrage movement, but they had not been embraced as equal partners in that fight. And so they also were interested in voting. The effort to get out the vote extended to Black women, and there was more intimidation throughout Florida against those who were encouraging Black women to vote. On the day of the election, there was an interesting situation that occurred as Black men showed up at the polls. One of the most prominent Black men was a man named Mose Norman, and he was denied the right to vote because it was said that he had not paid the poll tax. He had, but the registrar was not there to confirm it. He had gone on a fishing trip, so he wouldn't be there to confirm the voting rights of African Americans. When he left and came back, he was assaulted, and he returned to Ocoee with white men following him. A fight broke out, a gunfight broke out. 2 white men were killed. July Perry was wounded in the fight. He was taken into custody, taken to the jail, and in the early morning hours of November the 3rd, he was taken out of the jail and lynched, and his body was riddled with bullets. That didn't satisfy the violence of the moment, and white men from around Central Florida descended on Ocoee, and in a gunfight that lasted until the early morning hours of November the 4th. The town was set afire. All of the buildings within the northern part of the community were destroyed. People fled for their lives, and they didn't come back. In the south part of the community, African Americans were warned that they needed to get their affairs in order and leave in order to not have the same thing happen to them. They did. They sold their land for pennies on the dollar. One man said that his father was given $10 for 37 acres of land. They left Ocoee, and there were no African Americans living in Ocoee until 1981. It was one of those sundown towns. It was one of those places where African Americans had been pushed out of their lives, like Rosewood that came 3 years later. As I thought about this, and I thought about the kinds of things that had contributed to what happened in Ocoee, I recognize that there is a rhyme there. There is a way in which we all experience some of the continued kind of racism and denial of rights. The denial of rights that we thought we had overcome with civil rights. But in fact, we see them appearing again and again. And you saw it in the other presentations that came about today. When I thought of what would I charge people with in this teach-in, I decided that I would depend on a poem that was written by a local poet, Valeda Fluellen. The title of the poem is Skin on the Rope, and it says it much better than I ever could. We all have skin on the rope, whether a neck on the rope or a hand on the rope, we all have skin on the rope. The pain of that connection grips us, entangles us, compels us to examine our history, then construct tomorrow to manifest the wounds that need more than a Band-Aid, wounds that warrant more than a cursory examination. We must dissect the fibers of our history, inspect our suspect moral consciousness, which allows sin to fester as we turn our heads away from the atrocities that grab our children, drowning them in the muck of our making, leaving them unprepared, unprotected, but infected, generation after generation, from our refusal to acknowledge how we have failed our children all. We all have skin on the rope.
Thank you, Dr. Lester, for that presentation. Closing us out today is Dr. Amelia Lyons, who will be covering colonialism, migration, and universalist rhetoric, the historic roots of state violence against people of color in France. The floor is yours, Dr. Lyons.
Thank you so much, Brandon. I hope that my PowerPoint is now visible. Oh, now I'm unmuted. Thanks, Brandon. Thanks to the organizers. Thanks for all of the speakers today. I feel like I've learned a whole lot and I've been inspired by this event. In some ways, I feel a little out of place, yet I'm really glad that Dr. Gordon thought it was a good idea to expand beyond the US. Maybe not only because the US and France see themselves as the birthplaces of modern democracy and human rights, but also I think because you may have seen, if you've been reading a bit of it in the US media, that Black Lives Matter protests have inspired people around the world. So my short talk today has two parts. The first is to give you a handful of anecdotes that give a sense of the history of state violence against people of color. And the second is a brief examination of at least part of the reason I think France has so much difficulty talking about race. France, you can think of the yellow vests that you saw recently as a nation that prides itself on its tradition of protest. But it also is a nation that has a long history of institutional discrimination and systemic police abuse. Among the most common experiences of racial profiling that occurs is the police national ID checks. That is that everyone in France has to have their ID on them all the time. In July 2016, Adama Traoré, a Frenchman whose family was originally from Mali, was in his own neighborhood with his brother when the police approached for ID. Adama didn't have his ID on him and he ran. The police gave chase, pinned him to the ground, killing him. He died either of heart failure or, quote, asphyxiation from sustained pressure on his neck, eerily similar to George Floyd. You can see from these photographs, which are taken 4 years apart, his family, including her sister Asa, who's wiping a tear in the top photo and who is now a national figure in France, have been consistently demanding justice for 4 years. His killing and the effort to protest police abuse are not isolated incidents in France. In 2005, after 2 teens, one Arab, one Black, were electrocuted while hiding from police in a power substation in a community just north of Paris, made headlines all over the world. The initial protests, like the ones you see at the bottom in the large photograph with the t-shirts that say "Dead for Nothing," they met with very little response, no discussion of changes. As a result, what we saw nationally and internationally was a massive multi-week uprising. The unrest, the uprising, was seen only as riots in an effort to delegitimize it politically. In 1995, Matthew Kassovitz' film La Haine, which traced the experience of a Black, Arab, and Jewish young men in the Paris projects, was inspired by the 1993 murder of a young French-Nigerian man who was shot in the head while chained to a desk in police custody. The response to the film, including calling Kassovitz France's Spike Lee, was about the film as art. There was no public discussion of the film's themes, its display of police abuse, its discussion of the isolation and limited opportunities in these segregated suburbs. The film made international attention, but again, there was very little effort to talk about what the film was actually saying. All of this state-sponsored violence connects directly, this is what my work has been on for many years, to France's colonial past and to the migration and settlement of people from the French Empire in France. In 1961, at the height of the Algerian War, Maurice Pepon, then police chief, imposed a racial curfew on Algerians. Responding to frustration, not only about the curfew, but about brutal police tactics that included torture, Algerians staged a massive peaceful march down the main boulevards of Paris, becoming visible in a space where they were largely invisible. The police reacted with massive violence, beating and rounding up thousands of protesters. The photograph at the bottom shows a city bus used as a paddy wagon. Many of the buses were used, and in fact, many detainees were put into a concert hall for days when they ran out of room. More than 200 people were killed that night, many bodies dumped in the Seine. Thousands were sent to detention centers around France and in Algeria. The police never admitted to more than 2 deaths. Instead, when organizations like the Red Cross started pulling bodies out of the Seine, they blamed violence between nationalist factions of the Algerian nationalist movement. This remains one of the worst instances of state-sponsored violence against French citizens. The photo here really looks like a picture postcard until you know what it says. It's the kind of iconic vision of the Seine in the heart of Paris, but it has a warning to Algerians who demand their rights. French leaders had brought Pepon in 1958 because he had extensive experience. What was his experience? In the 1940s, he deported over 1,600 Jews to their deaths. Then he moved to Algeria. There, he learned colonial tactics of systematic state violence, including legalized torture. Only in 1998 was Pepon convicted of crimes against humanity for his role only in the deportation of Jews. No one has ever been held accountable for state violence against Algerians. Okay, so my time is short, and I want to connect these anecdotes to these cases to France's adherence to the idea of universalism and colorblindness, and it fits, I think, beautifully with our other panelists. France does not collect data on ethnicity or race, so we only have estimates about the number of French people of color, about discrimination in housing, education, employment, policing, etc. Why is this the case? Well, last month, President Macron affirmed that racism was, quote, a betrayal of universal republicanism. He added that it was a noble fight, but he said it would not be acceptable if, quote, it was taken over by separatists, end quote. That final bit is what matters here. It reveals what philosopher Etienne Balibar has argued, universalism as racism. French universalism presumes that the very essence of French democracy, of the republic based in secular values, can be applied to anyone, anywhere, right? This is what made it possible for the French civilizing mission in its colonial exploits. It also, though, undergirds the idea that France is a beacon of democracy and human rights. It rejects the royal, the old regime French idea and legal principle of privilege that meant that not everyone in France was equal before the law. So, like in the US, these principles seem to reject discrimination, but presuming the universal citizen denies the particularity. It denies those who are different, those who are treated differently, from ever truly accessing the supposed universal status. As a result, France demands that differences be minimized, be left at home, not to be put on display in public. Hide your cross, cover your yarmulke, don't wear the hijab to school. People are discouraged from identifying with a group. The word multiculturalism in France is communitarianism, and it has a negative connotation of choosing to be separate and to separate oneself from the whole. This logic has allowed even the French left to argue that France cannot collect data on racial inequalities in government records, including the census, with the exception of Algerians, which it did collect in the 1950s, that collecting this data, the argument goes, would be a form of discrimination. Some even argue that it would be akin to privilege, that difference before the state equals privilege. Only when the state sees no differences, they argue, is there equality. I want to finish by saying I think that our hope that this moment, as we see 20,000 people last month in Paris protesting, that it pushes white France, as I hope that this pushes white America to re-examine the space made for people of color and to change policy. There is hope. The images on this slide go back several decades, but France has to do more than to celebrate and embrace difference when it's easy, when they win the World Cup. France instead, like the US, has to acknowledge that prejudice is woven into the fabric of its supposedly colorblind state institutions, in its universalist principles. And it has to find a way to reimagine the national narrative if it's to become a truly multiracial and multi-ethnic democracy. Thank you.
Thank you for that presentation, Dr. Lyons. This brings us to the end of the second mini session, and now we are going to take questions. Once again, these questions are coming from those that are using the Zoom and that dropped these questions in the chat. The first question I want to direct to Dr. Lester, and it says, for Dr. Lester, I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about the current conditions of Paramore and how it went from being such a prosperous Black neighborhood to sadly an extremely impoverished and even gentrified white area in parts.
So I can't open my video. It says you have to do that. But you have stopped it. Okay. Okay, would you mind repeating the question?
Yes. It says, I was hoping, for Dr. Lester, I was hoping you could just talk a little bit about the current conditions of Paramore and how it went from being such a prosperous Black neighborhood to sadly an extremely impoverished and even gentrified white area in parts.
Thank you for that question. That I think has multiple facets to it. So I don't want to take up a whole period again to go through that. But my students in my economic history class have been looking at Paramore now for 3 years, trying to understand it and the economic challenges in Paramore. It was a very prosperous community at one time. Doctors and lawyers and business owners lived there. It was prosperous to the extent that African Americans could fund their own community because they couldn't get loans from the bank. The businesses were small, but they were vibrant businesses. It was a very important community. There are a number of things I think to talk about, ways in which it became a place where it wasn't prosperous. In part, it had to do with institutional changes, in part that were instituted in the city and by the state and even by the federal government as we decided to build roadways that bisected the community and cut off parts of the community and made it untenable. It was an easy place to build public buildings because they could buy the land cheaper there than they could somewhere else. And so it became a place where all of our public buildings and public entertainment was moved to Paramore. And that took away housing. How up as communities opened for African Americans in other parts of the city, they took advantage of those opportunities. And those who came in and bought up the housing that was there didn't have much of an incentive to do anything with it. It became a desert in many ways. It became a place where it was hard to find fresh food. It's hard to find medical help. It's hard to do any number of things in Paramore. And so it built on itself. It went from, it didn't happen overnight. It happened day by day and month by month as the community was eroded. It's a large question that needs lots of work, but that's a kind of thumbnail of it. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Dr. Lester. I want to focus on Dr. Edward Gonzalez-Tennant now. And the question here is kind of two questions in one. It says, first, would you explain a bit more about the sundown towns? And then the next question, it says, is there a map showing where the sundown towns and white-only communities were located? It would be interesting to see which cities these used to be in for comparative purposes. Thank you, from Donna, and the previous one was from Lindsay Pike.
Yes, thank you for those questions. So I referenced James Lowen's book. You saw that in my slide, Sundown Towns. It's easy to find. I guess the question, if I remember it correctly, so sundown towns form basically in a variety of ways. They either form as all white to begin with, or they form because minority communities are violently displaced from those places. So, you know, many places around the country, this history is pretty standard. Now, mapping this, that's a challenge. And James Lowen and other folks have certainly done this. Some of this work has been done in certain areas. But like a nationwide map, unless one of the other presenters is familiar with this, I think the challenge is these sundown towns are actually really ubiquitous. And so we can look today and still see in many places, North and South and West US, where there are majority or even mostly, or even in some places still all white communities. And so, you know, that's your first, I guess, hint or clue is look at the places. I mean, look at census data from the last, you know, from 2010, and we'll have another set in the next year or so. We're going to see this. We're still going to see basically white enclaves. And so that's your first indication about those locations around the country. And so I suspect all of and there are different, you know, I also referenced, I guess, kind of a flip of this, mapping these rural African-American communities, which have largely disappeared from the landscape. Those two things often go hand in hand. And so folks like Andrea Roberts out at Texas A&M and the Freedom Atlas project, which is mapping these disappeared and vanished African-American communities in Texas. They've already identified 500 of them. We have at least dozens of them here in Florida, and that story is repeated across the country. So no easy answer for a resource to point at, but a painfully common history.
Thank you for that, Dr. Gonzalez-Tennant. And next, I want to go back to Dr. Cox. So it says this question is for Dr. Jonathan Cox. How does one go about educating those who believe in colorblindness or who believe in false ideologies that Black people somehow do not work hard, or that they are the reason for their own social condition, not the vast effect of systematic racism, when those people just deny the actual research when it is brought up?
That's a great question. I mean, obviously it's a little bit of a difficult answer in terms of, enacting that answer. But one of the things you can do is, one, just be knowledgeable yourself, right? And so there exists tons of research out there, that showcases all the disparities that exist. And so one of the things that helps to dispel the ideas of colorblindness is to be able to see systemic racism. And I think that's one of the things that we're seeing right now, is that it's hard. One, it's hard to see, right? It's not easy to see systemic racism because it's so big and it involves so many different things. And then two, there are people like right now who are actively saying that systemic racism is not a thing, it doesn't exist, right? And so one of the ways that, you can help people who don't understand what systemic racism is and how, colorblindness is even a part of this, is to think about a metaphor that I like. It's Marilyn Frye used to talk about oppression, but I express the systemic racism as well. And so if you were to take the image of a bird cage and think of a bird being behind just a single bar, right, just looking at it really up close on this cage, it would be really easy for people to say, well, why can't this bird fly around, right? There's only one bar right here in front of its face, go to the left or right, and it gets out. But if you were to step back and take in the entire cage, what you end up seeing is that there are all these different bars that are interconnected, they're interwoven together, and it makes it much more difficult for that bird to get out, right? Not impossible necessarily, like if we were to compare to systemic racism. It's not impossible for Blacks and other people of color to, do well, to succeed, but it's much harder for them to do so because of the way that oppression, the way that racism interlocks and interconnects and creates this full bird cage, right? And so to see systemic racism, you have to step back. And so part of it is knowing the research that exists on all these different things. Again, if you're only looking at education by itself, or one aspect even of education, it becomes very difficult to see, when in reality, education is connected to these policies in housing, right? That we see, the redlining, the redistricting, all these different things. We see connections to criminal justice, we see connections to the healthcare system, right? They're all connected. And so if people can understand that all these things are connected and start to see the more fully encompassing picture, then they can understand why, it's much harder than to say, well, Black people are responsible for their own struggles, they should just do well, right? Because another part of this picture is that, there's data that exists that show us that even among Blacks who are high earners, high achievers, right, in the highest social class settings, they still experience discrimination and racism, right? You can't get away from it. And so if it was something where people were just supposed to be making, quote unquote, the right decisions, then even Blacks and other people of color who make the quote unquote right decisions, they wouldn't be experiencing these things. And the reality is that we see them doing so.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Cox. And the last question, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Lyons. And it says, given the institutional colorblindness of France, as Dr. Lyons describes, what does French society even begin to deconstruct colorblindness as equality?
Yeah, and they need to start the conversation, right? One of my good friends and colleagues, Papa Ndiaye, who is professor of American history in France, was quoted in the New York Times just about 2 weeks ago, saying that if you try to have this conversation in France, right, the issue is that nobody really is ready to have it. Nobody wants to have this conversation and even begin to think about policy change then, right? If the left can't have this conversation, it makes it much more difficult. I think, education has got to be critical. about the history of French colonialism, about the history of French violence, and about acknowledging that this is not really a problem of immigration, right? In the last slide, and often still in discussion in France, the assumption that these folks aren't really French, they're somehow immigrants, right? And so I think that becomes a part of it too, is acknowledging and understanding that France is multiracial, is multi-ethnic, and that these kinds of conversations have to be had with people of color at the table as part of the conversation, which I think too often in France is not the case.
Okay, thank you for that, Dr. Lyons. So this concludes the second session, and this concludes our teaching for today. As we close, I would like to thank our presenters for helping put this virtual teaching together. And special thanks to Tiffany Rivera with the UCF History Department for helping behind the scenes. Thank you to everyone who joined us today via Zoom and YouTube. I want to remind everyone that this teaching is being recorded and will be available on UCF's YouTube channel. The purpose of this teaching was to inform participants and viewers through engaging in these conversations. The charge is to follow that up with some sort of action. Very shortly, you will see a link to a list of UCF faculty resources on racism and struggles for racial justice. This list is compiled by faculty who participated in today's teaching, and these resources will be helpful to anyone looking for ways to continue the discussion after we leave here today. Once again, I thank the presenters, and I thank everyone for tuning in, and that concludes the teaching for today. Bye.